There is a particular kind of silence that arrives not from peace but from exhaustion, not the silence of someone who has found answers, but the silence of someone who has finally stopped pretending that the questions ever had the kinds of answers they were promised. If you have reached a point in your life where the things that used to excite you no longer move you, where the goals you once chased feel hollow even as you hold them, where you look at the world around you and feel something closer to observation than participation, then you are not broken. You are not depressed in the way that word is used carelessly. You are not lost. You are standing at the edge of something that most people never reach, and most of those who do reach it never have a name for it. There is a philosopher who gave it a name. There is a man who lived it, wrote about it, suffered through it, and left a philosophy so uncomfortable that the world mostly tried to ignore him. His name was Arthur Schopenhauer, and what he described was not a disorder. It was a doorway. And if you have been feeling what I suspect you have been feeling, then this video was made for you, not in the vague way that all content claims to be made for everyone, but in the precise and uncommon way that happens when someone describes exactly the interior of your experience, and you feel seen for the first time in longer than you can remember. Most people who talk about detachment talk about it as a spiritual achievement, something you earn through meditation retreats or years of disciplined practice, something that wise people in robes dispense to the deserving. But Schopenhauer would find that entire framework dangerously naive, because the kind of detachment he described does not come from effort. It comes from seeing. It comes from a moment or a series of moments in which the machinery behind ordinary life becomes visible to you, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The machinery is the will, not your personal will, not the will to succeed at a specific goal, but something far more ancient and impersonal, what Schopenhauer called the will to live, a blind and insatiable force that drives every living creature to desire, to strive, to suffer, and to desire again. He argued that this force is not inside you in the way your opinions are inside you. It is what you are made of. It is the substance beneath every thought you have ever had, every longing you have ever felt, every desperate grasp at something you were certain would finally make things feel right. And here is what most people never pause long enough to realize: the will does not care about you. It does not care whether you are happy. It does not reward effort with satisfaction. It uses you the way a river uses a stone it rolls over, indifferently, continuously, without memory of what it has already worn down. The first sign that you have entered radical detachment is that you no longer believe in the promise of arrival. For most of your life, you probably operated under a quiet but powerful assumption that somewhere ahead of where you currently stand, there is a version of your life in which things will feel complete. A relationship, a career milestone, a level of financial security, an achievement of recognition, something that will close the gap between what you are and what you are supposed to become. Schopenhauer called this illusion the carrot of existence. The will needs you to believe the carrot is real. The moment you stop believing it, the machinery becomes visible. If you have reached a point where you look at the things you used to want and feel no quickening of the pulse, no particular hunger, just a quiet and honest awareness that getting them will feel exactly like every other time you got something you wanted, which is to say, briefly satisfying and then suddenly insufficient, then you have begun to see through the veil. This is not cynicism, this is clarity. The difference matters enormously. The second sign is that other people's urgency feels foreign to you. You watch the people around you rush toward things, compete for status, argue over positions, perform versions of themselves for audiences they desperately want to impress, and you feel something that is difficult to describe accurately. It is not superiority. It is not contempt, though it can be mistaken for both. It is more like watching a theater piece you used to perform in, without remembering why the performance ever felt necessary. Schopenhauer spent much of his life in this position. He was brilliant and deeply alienated, not because he was broken, but because he had seen something that most people protect themselves from seeing. He understood that the social world is a vast mechanism for keeping the will engaged, for ensuring that desire never runs out of objects to attach itself to, that suffering never becomes so still that a person might actually examine it rather than escape it. When you lose the ability to feel that urgency as your own, it is a sign that something fundamental has shifted in how you relate to the will inside you. The third sign is that solitude has stopped feeling like deprivation. Schopenhauer was one of the great defenders of solitude, not because he romanticized loneliness, but because he understood that being alone is the only condition in which the will loosens its grip enough for something else to emerge. He wrote that a person who cannot bear to be alone cannot bear themselves, which is not a criticism, but a diagnosis. Most people flee solitude because in silence, the will has nothing to distract itself with, and what surfaces instead is the raw experience of existence without narrative, without forward motion, without the story that everything is building towards something. That is uncomfortable for a mind trained to always be chasing the next thing. But if you have found, perhaps to your own surprise, that you have started to prefer the quiet, that the company of your own thoughts has begun to feel more honest than most conversations, that being alone no longer fills you with restlessness or dread, but with something resembling relief, then you are standing where Schopenhauer stood. You are in the space where genuine thinking becomes possible. Before going further, I want to stop and ask you something directly, because I think you might be carrying this quietly in a way that has become heavy without you fully realizing how heavy it has gotten. Have you been feeling like you exist slightly outside of the world that everyone else seems to inhabit so naturally, like you are watching things from a distance that you did not choose and cannot close? If that resonates with you, if that sentence landed somewhere real, I want you to go to the comments right now and write, "I have been living at a distance and I finally understand why." Not because it is a gesture, but because there are people who will read that and feel less alone in something they have never been able to name. Your words in the comments are not just interaction with an algorithm. They are a message to another person sitting somewhere feeling exactly what you feel, who needed to know that someone else has been there too. The fourth sign is that art and music have begun to hit you in ways that feel disproportionate to what is actually happening. Schopenhauer believed that aesthetic experience, particularly music, was the only activity in which the will temporarily suspends itself. When you are genuinely moved by a piece of music or a work of art, what is happening, according to Schopenhauer, is that the will has released its grip on you for a moment, and you have become pure perception, a subject of knowing without desire, without the forward-leaning urgency that normally characterizes every waking moment. He called this the most peaceful state available to human beings because it is the only one not contaminated by wanting. If you have been finding that certain pieces of music reach you in ways that feel almost unbearable, that certain works of art produce in you a silence that is unlike any other silence, then your capacity for this state has deepened. You have become more permeable to the one form of experience that Schopenhauer believed momentarily dissolves the wall between individual suffering and universal existence. The fifth sign is that you have developed an unexpected tenderness towards suffering, including your own. Schopenhauer's ethics rested entirely on compassion, what he called Mitleid, suffering with. He argued that the only genuine moral impulse is the one that arises when you recognize your own suffering in the face of another, when the boundary between self and other becomes transparent enough for you to feel what they feel, not as an abstract exercise in empathy, but as a direct recognition. This is only possible in someone who has sat with their own suffering honestly, rather than constantly trying to exit it. If you have noticed that you are less quick to judge, that other people's pain reaches you more directly than it used to, that you feel something open in you when you encounter someone struggling in ways that used to make you uncomfortable or impatient, this is a sign. The will is losing its insistence on keeping you separate from the world. The armor that self-interest builds, slowly over years, is thinning. The sixth sign is that you have stopped explaining yourself. There is a version of social life that runs entirely on justification, on the performance of having reasons that others will accept, on managing how you appear inside the minds of people around you. For most of human life, this performance is so automatic, it does not even feel like a performance. It feels like just talking, just being. But there comes a point when the will loses some of its power over you, where the need to be understood correctly, to be seen as you wish to be seen, to have your choices ratified by external approval, simply becomes less pressing. Not because you have become cold or indifferent to connection, but because you have discovered that the interior of your experience is too complex and too particular to be accurately represented in the languages that social approval requires. Schopenhauer himself was famously difficult, argumentative in some contexts, and completely withdrawn in others, not because he lacked social skill, but because the transaction of approval had ceased to feel worth its cost to him. If you have found yourself less interested in being understood and more interested in simply existing as you actually are, even in contexts where this creates friction, this is a sign. The seventh sign is that you have begun to experience a strange gratitude for the difficulty of your life. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive sign of all, and it is the one that Schopenhauer's philosophy makes most comprehensible. He argued that suffering is not an aberration in existence, but its fundamental texture, that the will in its blindness guarantees dissatisfaction, that to be alive is to be in a state of perpetual wanting and perpetual insufficiency. This sounds like despair when you first hear it, and it is designed to sound like despair because most people will stop there and refuse to go further. But the full movement of Schopenhauer's thought does not stop at the diagnosis. It continues to something that, if you follow it all the way, becomes something astonishing. If suffering is the ground of existence, then your suffering is not a mistake. It is not evidence that you have failed or that the universe has singled you out for cruelty. It is the same substance that moves through every conscious being that has ever existed, and if you have begun to feel something like gratitude, not for the pain itself, but for what the pain has revealed to you, for the clarity it has carved into you, for the things it stripped away that needed to be stripped away, so that what remains could be more genuinely itself, then you have arrived somewhere that very few people arrive. You have begun to do what Schopenhauer did at his best, which is to use the weight of existence as a lens rather than a wall. Radical detachment is not the end of feeling. It is the beginning of feeling what is actually there rather than what the will needs you to feel. It is the capacity to sit inside your own experience without being entirely consumed by its demands, to observe the machinery without being run over by it, to look at the world with open eyes rather than eyes shaped entirely by wanting. Schopenhauer did not promise happiness. He never pretended that seeing clearly would make things easy, but he offered something rarer than happiness and more durable. He offered the possibility of a life lived without the constant grinding performance of someone who does not yet know what they are. If these 7 signs have described something you recognize in yourself, then you are not broken. You are becoming lucid, and lucidity, as Schopenhauer knew, is its own form of grace. If this reached something in you, if any part of this named what you have been living without being able to say it, please give this video a like, not as a number on a screen, but as a way of telling the algorithm that this kind of content matters, that there are people who need philosophy that takes their interior life seriously, that not everyone watching wants distraction and shortcuts. Every like sends this to someone else who is sitting with the same weight you carry and has not yet found a word for it. And if you want to keep going deeper into Schopenhauer, into the philosophy of suffering and clarity, and what it means to live honestly in a world that rarely rewards honesty, then subscribe to this channel. This space was built for the people who have always felt slightly out of place in a world that moves too fast and asks too little of itself. Every video here is made for you, for the person who needs ideas that meet the full complexity of what you actually experience, not the simplified version that fits on a motivational poster. Subscribe, and let this be the place where your thinking finds company.